I would like to talk about exploring the magnetic quantum states of single surface adsorbed atoms. And before I go into this field of single atoms, I would like to show a few things which are basically more historic, that show basically from where we started when we went into that field. So the first part is discovery of single atom magnets, how we really, the way that we went for discovering their fascinating properties. And then I present you a few of the systems that are presently known as being a stable magnet. So it's basically like a permanent magnet, but in a single atom. And then I will show a little bit about the role of the valence electrons, which is often neglected. And then finally, I show a few ideas how we can do the next step and go really to single atom qubits possibly. Okay, so so let's start with a very general introduction into the magnetism of ensembles of atoms that are interacting with each other. So one property which is characterizing these magnetic systems is magnetization. Magnetization is basically the strength of the magnetic magnetization here when you fully saturate your sample. So you can think of your sample like being a piece of bulk material. When you apply a strong enough field, you can fully saturate this. So all the domains are pointing into the direction of the external field. And then you measure your magnetization. So this magnetization is basically defined by the magnetic moment per atom and then the number of atoms that you have in your sample. The second property is magnetic order. If the magnetic order is antiferromagnetic, for example, you would not see such a large magnetic moment because the magnetic moments are compensated. If the order is ferromagnetic, you have different domains and you have just the task to orient these domains all along the magnetic field. And what is also very important, as you will see, magnetic anisotropy. Magnetic anisotropy simply says, what is the energy difference in magnetizing your sample in a certain direction compared to another direction? So what is this energy difference? And now if you take such a magnetization curve, for example, for a ferromagnetic material, you can see that if you fully magnetize this material, you go down to zero field, you have still a certain magnetization. And this magnetization is called remanent magnetization. And that's the magnetization where we store information on our magnetic hard drives. And then you can see a certain property here. This is the field that you need to switch your magnetization from spin down to spin up, for example. This is called the coercitive field. So the magnetic anisotropy is giving basically this field at which you can switch your magnetization. And then the magnetic order and magnetic anisotropy give you also basically what is the remanent magnetization. So now let's go into low-dimensional systems. And I don't start immediately with single atoms. I want to start with bigger islands, just to make things very plausible for you. We start with islands which are like about 1,000 atoms in size. And you can see here, we have these cobalt islands. They are a monolayer high, and they are sitting on a platinum 111 surface. We measure the magnetic properties not with STM directly. This is an STM image showing just the morphology. But we measure the magnetic properties with the technique which is called magneto-optical Kerr effect. So we measure basically by magneto-optics the magnetization of the sample. And we measure this as a function of temperature. And what you see here is that at zero temperature, you cannot magnetize your sample because the field that we apply to measure this zero field susceptibility is not sufficient to turn around these islands. So you can do what you want with your field, but you cannot turn them around. Then you increase the temperature, and at some point, the thermal excitation comes so high that you can turn them around with the field that you apply. And then at some higher temperature, it goes down as 1/T. So this is the zero field susceptibility as a function of temperature, and it characterizes what is called a superparamagnetic system. So this means that at low temperatures, these islands are ferromagnetically ordered. And when you go to high temperatures, for example, at this temperature, which is referred to as blocking temperature, they still stay ferromagnetically ordered, but the whole spin of one island can reverse. Now we have the measurement of this morphology, because we do this magnetic measurement in the same ultra high vacuum chamber where we do this STM measurement. So we know exactly how many atoms are sitting there. And now if we say that the magnetic anisotropy is simply proportional to the number of atoms, which is the simplest assumption that you can make, we get a green line, which is the fit of our data. And you can argue, you can push this green line to the right in introducing simply more magnetic anisotropy, but it can be seen easily here, that's not a good fit. So it seems to be such that the magnetic moment comes from each atom, but the anisotropy doesn't come from each atom. If we go further, we can say, okay, the anisotropy is simply given by the perimeter atoms, and the atoms which are sitting inside don't contribute at all. Or we can say that we have even a more extreme case. The anisotropy comes from the perimeter atoms, but the ones that are sitting inside even want to be magnetized in another direction as the perimeter atoms. So this is basically a very satisfying fit. This means that these perimeter atoms seem to play a very important role. So the journal where this was published was even saying that the perimeter atoms do all the work, basically. So we did some experiment where we demonstrated that this is really the case. If you look into the numbers, you can see that this magnetic anisotropy is in the range of, let's say, 1 millieV per atom for the atoms which are sitting at the perimeter. And it's a factor of 20 or so lower for the atoms which are sitting inside. So there's a factor of 20 difference. Now, in order to convince people that they're skeptical about this, we made an extreme sample where we have something which is non-magnetic in the middle. So this is a platinum island, and we just decorate this platinum with a magnetic material which is cobalt. So if it's true that the atoms which are sitting at the perimeter do all the work, basically, these islands should switch at the same temperature as the ones that are fully filled with cobalt. And that's exactly what happens. So in principle, if you look into this curve, it looks very much the same as the curve that I showed for fully cobalt-filled islands. So this means that this magnetic anisotropy energy comes really from the low coordinated atoms that are sitting at the perimeter. So this was the first observation that led us to look into smaller and smaller dimensions just to see how this continues. Now, if we look into single atoms, we cannot do anymore this magneto-optical carrier effect measurement because the signal is proportional to the number of magnetic moments that you have to the power of 2 in one structure. And you can imagine you can do this for 1,000 atom big islands. You can do it down to a few hundred atoms, but not down to a single atom. If you want to go to one atomic chains or to even smaller structures, you have to use synchrotron light. And here I just show you that you can basically do an experiment which is called X-ray magnetic dichroism, which is giving you elements specifically the magnetic properties of the atoms in the sample. One uses left and right-hand polarized light. And with these different polarizations, you have different selection rules. Here you can excite your electrons. And you excite the electrons in principle from the 2p1/2, for example, for a 3D element to the unfilled, unoccupied states here above the Fermi level, or you go from the 2p3/2 to the unoccupied states above the Fermi level. If you have a non-magnetized sample, then for the two polarizations, you have basically the same signal. So there's no difference between these two polarizations. Once you magnetize your sample, you can see here in this extreme case, you have no density of states available for this spin direction, whereas you have a lot of density of states available for this one. So this changes dramatically the peak heights of these two different peaks. So this is excitation from 2p3/2 to 3D unoccupied and 2p1/2 to 3D unoccupied, and you can see that there's a big difference. So this is sufficient for us to know that you can take this technique to measure the magnetization of the sample. And if you want to be more quantitative, you can also look into the absorption spectrum here. This is for no polarization dependent. So you add up both polarizations and then you subtract both polarizations and then you get the signal here. And what's important for you is just to look into this XMCD signal. So there's one peak which is called A1, the area below this peak, A3, and this one is the A2 area. And if you look into the dipole selection rules and to some rules that are known for XMCT, you can determine with this technique, for example, the orbital moment divided by the spin moment just by adding these areas and subtracting these areas. So basically, if you measure these spectra, it gives you basically the ratio of the orbital moment to the spin moment, and it gives you also the total magnetization of the sample. So it's a very good technique. Now, since this is an integrating technique as the one that we have done before with nectar-optical Kerr effect, we have to be sure about the ensemble that we are characterizing with this integrating technique. So we have to do again STM just to study how this ensemble looks like. And on the left-hand side, you see a clean platinum 111 crystal with very few defects. And now we can deposit cobalt atoms, and we do this at 10 Kelvin. And this is a temperature where the cobalt atoms come to rest at the site of impact. They basically come onto arbitrary sites. They come to rest. They don't diffuse around. And if you put here 0.005 monolayers, this means that you put only 5 atoms per 1,000 substrate atoms. They are sufficiently far apart that it's very unlikely that two land by accident one close to each other. So they are basically forming only single atoms. This can be calculated. The mean size is 1.01, so you have only 1% more than single atoms. Now we're preparing these samples, and you cannot afford to prepare the sample in your lab. Look with STM, take it out of the lab and go to the synchrotron, because of course these are samples that would immediately react with oxygen. One has to prepare them in the same machine where you do the measurement. So in the synchrotron, we do exactly the same experiment that we do in the lab, and we have even a synchrotron facility where we can look with STM and check the morphology. And now you see here two curves, which is magnetization curves as a function. You measure the magnetization of this sample as a function of the applied external field. And you see if you do this in the out of plane direction, you can fully saturate your sample with a field of, let's say, roughly 7 Tesla. If you apply this field at a grazing incidence, you have a hard time to saturate the sample. You have single atoms that are sitting on the sample, and you want to saturate their magnetization in some close to in-plane direction, and apparently this does not work. So this means that you have really a very, very strong tendency of these single atoms to be magnetized out of plane. They want to be magnetized out of plane, and you have a hard time to tilt the magnetization in plane. You can see here that we have made 2 fits to the data, which are really satisfying. And the fit look a little bit complicated, but if you look into this formula, it's very easy. It basically shows you the unit vector of the magnetization of each of these atoms times the unit vector of the magnetic field that you apply. And this boils down to the cosine of the angle between the two. Then you have the Zeeman energy here, and then you have the magnetocrystalline anisotropy energy. And this magnetocrystalline anisotropy energy is basically an inverted parabola. And what goes into this inverted parabola is, again, only the cosine of the angle between the external magnetic field and the magnetization. So what comes out of this fit, the only fit parameters that we have is basically the magnetic moment of the entire atom and the anisotropy energy. And I told you before that you can measure the ratio between orbital moment and spin moment. So what you get out from this fit here is both numbers. You get like 3 μBors roughly. And from the XMCD measurements, you know that the ratio between these two is such that it obeys to this to these values. So we have 1.1 μBor orbital moment and 2.3 μBors spin moment. The anisotropy is 9 millieV. So we have seen before that these atoms that are sitting at the rim, they have an anisotropy energy of roughly 1 millieV. And here we have 9 millieV. So this is a factor 10 more. Now let's compare this with bulk cobalt. If you look into bulk cobalt, you can see that it has an anisotropy energy of 45 microelectron volts. So 45 microelectron volts is 200 times smaller than the anisotropy energy that these single atoms have. So this was a result which was really very surprising. So just to show you how this was done. So in principle, you have a cobalt sample, which is HCP from the crystalline structure. you magnetize the sample out of plane. You have an easy time to do this because it wants to be magnetized out of plane. And then you try to magnetize it close to in plane. And if you look at these two curves, you basically get the orbital, you get the magnetic moment, and you get the anisotropy energy. So let's just remember now that we have 200 times more than bulk for single atoms sitting on a surface, on the platinum 111 surface. Okay, so what is the origin of this very strong difference between the atoms which are sitting in a volume and the atoms which are sitting at the border of an island, or the atoms which are sitting like isolated on a surface? In order to understand this, we have been measuring different sizes. You can see here the anisotropy of a single atom. Then we have made islands which have 3 atoms, then 5 atoms, and so on. And you can see that this anisotropy goes down as the number of atoms per island increases. So it's really again showing this effect of coordination that seems to play a very important role. And now if you look onto the right-hand side, we can see that this orbital moment, which is preserved in these atoms, almost has the same trend. It is not exactly the same. So the one for the single atoms, I was just superimposing, but now if you go down to bigger and bigger sizes, you see that the orbital moment approaches here a value of 0.3 roughly, but still with some goodwill, you could say that it must be a relation between this orbital moment and the magnetocrystalline anisotropy energy. And this is something that has been known before. So there are papers in the literature that are basically postulating that there should be a very strong interaction, because in principle, if you think of a spin, the spin itself doesn't know a direction in space. It has to be isotropic. But a orbital moment is something where you can think in a classical way and say that's an electron that is in an orbit, and this orbit has a certain orientation in space. So the only thing that can have an orientation in space is an orbital moment. If you have no orbital moment, then you have no anisotropy by definition, basically. And if you have a very small orbital moment, you have very small anisotropy. If you have a big one, you have big anisotropy. So these papers here of Patrick Brune, who was the pioneer in this, show that you have here the magnetocrystalline anisotropy scales basically with the spin-orbit coupling and with the difference between the orbital magnetic moment in 2 directions. We have a few systems where we have verified this. This constant is 0.2, but it can be also 0.4, 0.5 sometimes, but it's a very good rule of thumb that these 2 quantities are related. Now, that's fun because we have found that this single atom has very high anisotropy, and what we wanted to do is find systems where we can indeed store information in a single atom. So we have found this magnetic anisotropy energy, which is sufficiently high that if this atom would behave as a classical magnet, you could go for these from the spin-up state, for example, via a projection of 0 in the plane, which means that you have the magnetic moment lying in the plane, and then to the spin down direction. And if it would behave like a classical magnetic moment with this anisotropy energy that we have measured, it would have a relaxation time of roughly 1 second at 2 Kelvin. So it should be a stable magnet at 2 Kelvin. Okay, you of course know that it's a quantum mechanical system. So the spin quantum number can either be -1, +1, and then it can go up here to a spin quantum number of 0. So this triggered basically experiments in the group of Roland Wiesenthal in Hamburg. They were able to measure magnetization curves on a single atom. So they took a spin polarized tip and they measured really on a single atom a magnetization curve just by looking into the contrast that is gained from the spin polarized measurement. And they did this at 4.2 Kelvin and at 0.3 Kelvin. So if the cobalt atoms would behave like classical magnets, they should see here a large opening of the hysteresis because it should be a stable magnet. So you should need some coercitive field to switch them. Instead, they see a fully paramagnetic curve. So it's fully reversible. You can go up with the field or down with the field, and you don't see any opening. So this was a great deception, of course, because the hope was to find something where you can store information. So the hope was to find something stable, but it's not so bad, because if you look into the fits that are done here at these two different temperatures, they have used exactly the same fit formula that we have used, which is also what one should do. So here you see the cosinus that appears instead of our different way of writing things. They have put in our anisotropy energy that we have measured. So this is not a fit parameter. And the only fit parameter is the magnetic moment, basically, that each atom has. And the magnetic moment is 3 μ. So you see that the histogram here is pretty sharp and has a peak at 3 μ. And that's exactly what we expect, because we have an orbital moment of 1 μ and a spin moment of 2 μ. So that's really confirming what we did before with ensembles on a single atom basis. So this was quite nice, but still we don't have a stable magnet. So then we were investigating these 3D elements on different systems. And this has been done in the group of Andreas and Chris at IBM. So they were telling us at some moment, Harry, we have found something interesting. We have excitation energies of magnetic transitions. You can see here at 60 millieV roughly, or 57 millieV. And if you want to prove that these are of magnetic origin, you have simply to apply a strong magnetic field, and then you see that something happens. So they shift, the energies shift, as you would expect, because they have to shift with the same energy. So what happens here is that you have a magnetic ground state, and the splitting of this ground state in the magnetic field is different from the splitting of the first excited state. And therefore you see different transition energies going from the 0 state here to the 2 state, or from the 1 state to the 3 state. And that's exactly, this first step is going from the 1 state to the 3 state, and the second step from the 0 state to the 2 state. So these excitation energies are pretty big. So this means that the anisotropy energy must be pretty big for the system. We were talking before about 9 millieV. Now we are talking like 57 millieV. So we did some XMCD measurements triggered by these observations of Andreas and Chris. And you can see here how these XMCD experiments are working. So you basically measure in 2 different directions the X-ray absorption spectrum, which is shown here. And then you try to simulate the spectrum. And the only ingredient that you have is basically the crystal field that acts on the atom. And this defines the energy scale that the atom feels, the quantum states, and you can calculate basically these transitions. And if you compare the red curve with the red simulated curve and the blue curve with the blue simulated curve, one has to say that's satisfying agreement, satisfactorily agreement. And also if you look into the difference between the 2 polarizations, you can see here that the XMCD signal is also very well reproduced. So you can deduce from this what the D-shell occupancy is, for example, for these cobalt atoms sitting on the MgO surface. What is also interesting is now you can look into the crystal field simulations that you did in order to reproduce these spectra. And you can say, okay, let's turn off the axial field, for example, and any other crystal field. Then you have a state here with plus minus 3 μ orbital moment, spin moment like this. Then after an axial crystal field that you need, you get an orbital moment which is 2.8 μ. Then you turn on spin orbit coupling. You get still an orbital moment which is roughly 3 μ. And then you turn on the magnetic field and you split here the different states. And this is really fascinating because we have measurements from STM where we measure transition energies on an energy scale of 50 millieV. And then we have here ensemble measurements where we measure basically X-ray absorption spectra, XMCD, and so on. And we fit these spectra, and by fitting these spectra, we can basically identify what the different states are. And we can also express what the energy difference is here. And the energy difference is given by the spin orbit coupling for cobalt, which is 22 millieV, times the orbital moment, and the orbital moment is 3 μ, so it's 60 millieV, roughly. And that's exactly what is observed in STM. So that's really very interesting that these 2 different techniques give very similar results. STM is better suited to measure these excitation energies because you can do this very precisely. And XMCD is better suited to identify these orbital moments, identify the spin moment, and so on of these states. Okay, now we have a system that has 60 millieV. So we almost can't go further because that's roughly 1,000 times the bulk anisotropy energy. And still, it's not a stable magnet, as you can see here. If you take such XMCD magnetization curves, they are fully reversible. So it's still not a stable magnet. If you look into the time it takes for reversal, it's like 200 microseconds. So you would not like to store information and have every 200 microseconds a problem. So in principle, this is, again, a very fascinating system because it's the highest anisotropy that you can achieve in a single atom, because we have here a system where the system has preserved the orbital moment, which is otherwise only found in the gas phase. You cannot have more than 3 Bors, and it has preserved roughly all the 3 Bors. So that's fascinating by itself. But there must be something else which gives the stability of these single atom magnets, and which was preventing us from finding their stability so far. So what happens if you put a magnetic atom in a crystal field? You get ideally such an inverted parabola. So the maximum here has this magnetocrystalline anisotropy energy that I called K before. So for cobalt, this would be 60 millieV or 58 millieV. And now you have these different states. And if you want to reverse the magnetization, you have to climb up this ladder and go all the way up to the maximum and then down on the other side. Now, if your system has a crystal field, which is not a uniaxial crystal field, but a realistic crystal field, for example, the atom is bound to one atom at the surface, and then it has 3 next nearest neighbors. So these 3 next nearest neighbors would impose a symmetry which is threefold in the plane. And if you impose this threefold symmetry, you have different colors that appear at these different states, because they belong to different symmetry groups. And these states that belong to the same symmetry group, they can hybridize. The other states are orthogonal. They cannot talk to each other. So you have here a red state, for example, and then you have a blue state, a green state, and then again a red one. So every 3 times you have a similar color. So these states can interact with each other and hybridize. So this one with this one, for example, this one with this one, and so on. Now, if you look into the green ones and you have a threefold crystal field, the green ones are plus minus 6. So you can see that the difference is 12, and you can divide this by 3. So therefore, the green ones, they can interact. And what they do, instead of being plus minus 6, is they form a hybrid state, which is a superposition of plus minus 6. And they have also some splitting, and the splitting basically defines with which probability you go here and then tunnel through this barrier and go on the other side. So the stability is given by the possibility to tunnel and to turn the magnetization around by this tunneling effect, which is shown here. And you have also, in addition, scattering with phonons. Okay, so now having this in mind, we can select systems that have more likelihood to be stable magnets, because you can imagine if you have a very small spin moment, as in these 3D elements, it's not so likely that you have a crystal field symmetry where you can make them stable. So one has to look for systems that have a high magnetic moment, a high spin value, or a high total angular momentum, for example, and then you can make potentially a stable magnet. So the first one that was discovered was holmium on MgO. And MgO is the sample that we like a lot, because MgO reduces the scattering of electrons that come from the substrate. And holmium atoms have this property to have a large total angular momentum. So on the left-hand side, you see here an STM image of this system, holmium atoms sitting on a MgO surface. And on the right-hand side, you see an XMCD measurement. Now, one has to be a little bit careful with these measurements, because in principle, if you do an XMCD measurement, you bombard your system with high energy photons. And in addition, you make ensemble measurements, so that it can be that some of your holmium atoms are sitting at adsorption sites that are not the ones that you are interested in, but nevertheless, they contribute. So in this case, for example, here we have some of the holmium atoms that are sitting on oxygen sites, but some of the holmium atoms are sitting on bridge sides of this MgO sample. So the ones that are sitting on oxygen sides, they have a 4-fold crystal field symmetry. The other ones have a 2-fold crystal field symmetry. So basically one has to be aware that this measurement here is first of all a superposition of at least 2 different species. And second, you are really giving a hard time to your sample, because in principle you are bombarding your sample with these high energy photons. Okay, so if you want to know what the intrinsic properties are, then you measure as a function of photon flux. We have measured how long it takes for the magnetization to relax to the other magnetization direction. And you can see here these relaxation times as a function of flux. If you go to a very low flux, we have 1,000 seconds, 1,500 or so. If you increase the flux a lot, we have 100 seconds. So as a function of the flux, we can either drive the system strongly and then it relaxes fast, or it takes more time to relax. But now if we measure this, we can of course extrapolate to 0 flux. And if you extrapolate to 0 flux, the atoms have a very strong stability. For example, here, if you go into this extrapolation, they would be stable for 1 hour. Or if you go into this extrapolation at 10 millitesla, they would be stable 3 hours plus infinite minus 2 hours. So in principle, they would be potentially stable for infinite times. So this means that we expected from these measurements that the intrinsic properties of holmium are that they could be potentially infinitely stable. And this has been shown, but by a different technique. So this is a measurement which is really the least perturbing measurement you can imagine. You can see here on the left-hand side 2 holmium atoms which are sitting on the same adsorption side. And then you have here an iron atom which is sitting again on the same adsorption side. So from this we can conclude that this is on an oxygen side, oxygen side, oxygen side. Now, Andreas Heinrich has pioneered in 2015 electron spin resonance on single atoms. And the electron spin resonance, of course, is very sensitive to external magnetic fields. You apply some external field, but then in addition, these holmium atoms also produce some field. They produce a stray field. And if these holmium atoms would switch around, then you would see the superposition of 2 states of them in the stray field. If these holmium atoms are stable units, then you see a stable stray field which is produced by them. And the fact that there are 4 different peaks at different frequencies proves basically that you can put these holmium atoms into states and they stay at these states. If they would not stay at these states, you would see all other peaks appearing here. You can basically inject electrons with high enough kinetic energy to switch these holmium atoms in such a way that both are pointing down, then you get a peak here, or you switch them that both are pointing up, you get a peak here, or for some other configuration, you get these peaks. So it's basically the demonstration that you can have really an atomic scale memory, in this case, which is a small memory, of course, it's only 2 bits, but you can imagine that you arrange these systems up to like 10 or 20 atoms and read them out with a single iron sensor if you arrange them in the right position. That's quite nice. We can also do another measurement. STM itself has a possibility to have spin polarized tips. So we can put a spin polarized tip on top of such a holmium atom. And if the external valence shells are a little bit polarized, we can read out the magnetization. And this is done here. You can see here, the atom is in a state where the magnetization points down. And once the atom switches, the magnetization points up. And you see there's a difference in apparent height, which is roughly 3 picometers or so. And that's due to the fact that it's like a tunnel magnetoresistance effect. It's a tunnel junction where one of the electrodes switches its direction. We have applied for this measurement the magnetic field pointing up. So the magnetic field is really pretty strong. It's 8 Tesla. And you have here a holmium atom which points down. So the holmium atom is not very happy because it points against the magnetic field. It wants to be along the magnetic field. And we wait here for about 1,000 seconds and we still see no single switching of this holmium atom. Then we inject electrons with high kinetic energy to switch it on purpose. Then it stays in the spin up state. Then we inject again electrons to switch it on purpose. It's in the spin down state. and then again electrons injected spin up state. So you can inject these electrons to switch it from up and down, but it never switches by itself. So this means that we have here an observation time of roughly 2000 seconds, and there's not a single spontaneous switching event. And what you should notice is that this is a measurement which is not done at 2 Kelvin or 3 Kelvin. This is a measurement that has been done at 35 Kelvin. So these are really stable magnets. Now we go to 45 Kelvin, and you can see here that the spin down state appears with this tip a little bit higher than the spin up state. And the spin down state after some time switches by itself. Then you eject electrons again, you switch it to the spin down state. It switches after some time by itself. Spin down state switches after some time by itself. So this spin down state at 45 Kelvin, it's simply too warm. So by some thermal excitation, phonon scattering, it switches. So in principle, this holmium atom is not only a stable magnet at low temperatures. So as we have seen, it can be stable for at least a few hours at low temperatures, but you can go up to 35 Kelvin. It's stable for, let's say, roughly 1 hour, and you can apply magnetic fields of 8 Tesla, and you cannot switch it basically with a magnetic field. So you have to inject electrons really to switch it. It's a very stable magnet. Okay, the second permanent magnet, which is composed of a single atom, was discovered in the same year, and this is dysprosium atom sitting on graphene. So you can see that there is some order. These dysprosium atoms, they like to sit on certain areas of the moire pattern, which is formed by graphene on this iridium-111 surface. And you can see that there's some opening of the hysteresis. In addition, you see that there are some steps of this magnetization curve. And it's quite interesting to have such a very rich behavior, because these steps tell you actually at which magnetic fields you should have some level crossings and where the magnetic states can change. So that's quite nice. We have now 2 systems, both discovered in 2016. Now there's another system that has been discovered, which is this time dysprosium on MgO. So again, you see here 2 iron atoms sitting on MgO, and for iron it's pretty clear. Iron wants to sit on oxygen sites. So also this dysprosium, you can see, is sitting here on oxygen sites. And here you see again the switching of the dysprosium atoms, which spin up and spin down. And now you can record how often it switches as a function of the external parameters, for example, external magnetic field, tunnel voltage that you apply. And if you apply here different tunnel voltages, you can see that at 150 millivolts, it starts to switch. This is really amazing, because you can inject electrons with a kinetic energy that have 150 millieV, and then it starts to switch. But below, it doesn't switch. So this is giving you already a first idea on the stability of this atom. You need more than 150 millieV to switch it. So the anisotropy must be at least 150 millieV. And here you can see certain steps where the switching rate changes. And from this one can basically produce the first guess of a level scheme. In this case, it's not a first guess. It's something that has been supported also by synchrotron measurements and also by density functional theory calculations. And in principle, what comes out is that the magnetic crystalline anisotropy energy is 250 millieV. So that's really a system that has yet more anisotropy energy. And I don't have the time to show you exactly these results, but in principle, if you look up this paper, you can see that these are like Lego pieces that you can use, like as permanent magnets that you can put at some place. You can magnetize them as you want. You can put them even pretty close, and you can magnetize them still independently one from another. So we now have really a toolbox where we can put some permanent magnetic moments at the surface. Okay. So these are the transitions that are allowed. So it's a delta J of 4, delta J of 8, delta J of 12, which are the transitions which are correlated with a delta M of 0. So you will not believe it, because if you see here, that's not a delta M of 0. If you go from minus 15½ to this state here, it's much more than delta M of 0. But this has to do with the fact that these wave functions are not pure. So you have always a superposition of different states. And the states that I told you that are agreeing with the symmetry of this adsorption site, they can hybridize. So you have different amplitudes in front of these different states, and this creates these transitions that are possible. So the ground state is plus minus 50.5, but you can have these transitions here. So now we have something that Richard Feynman was dreaming of, that you can really store information in single atoms. So in principle, we have conquered some systems or discovered some systems. They can store information in single atoms. They stay stable for hours. And you can even have superlattices of these. And just to repeat some of what I said before, they can be stable up to hours. Anisotropies can be up to 250 millieV. And then the densities are 100 tera, or they can be even a factor of 10 higher in density, potentially. So let's see whether we really fully understand what's going on, because the whole community working with these rare earth atoms is always tacitly assuming that a rare earth atom is only described by its total angular momentum, which comes from the 4f electrons. If you do this, then you are ignoring that these external electrons are there, and these external shells can be also spin polarized. And we see strong evidence for this. The first evidence is, for example, that we can form these nice superlattices. If you just put down atoms at arbitrary positions, so it's not very likely that you can make such a nice superlattice. So you need some Mori pattern, which is there, which is the graphene sitting on the iridium surface. So you can see here that it forms a Mori pattern where you have basically 10 graphene unit cells sitting on 9 unit cells of the iridium 111 surface. And it's clear that the binding energy of the atoms can be different here, for example. And then if they like to be here, then they are really a lot of their time here. But of course, it can happen that a second one is deposited close to the first one, and then you would form a dimer. And what we have found is that the number of dimers is relatively low compared to what you would expect from statistics. And if you want to explain exactly as a function of coverage, as a function of temperature, how many dimers we form, how many monomers we still have, we have to assume a potential which is like this. So you see a curve which is red, which is basically the corrugation of this potential here. So the atoms are just moving on the graphene. Then you see some green curve, which is the modulation that comes from the Mori pattern. But then you have to introduce one blue curve here, and which is a repulsive interaction between the atoms. So they have to have a repulsion between them. And only if we introduce this repulsion, we can reconcile these experiments. And a repulsion can only come from charge. And this means that these atoms have to give some of that charge away, or they get some charge from the substrate. What we find is that the dysprosium atoms give, for example, 0.7 electrons. And if they give 0.7 electrons from the external shells, this means that the external shells are spin polarized. If they would giving 1 electron, a full electron, they would be fully spin polarized, these external shells. So if they are spin polarized, you should see a big contrast, and that's exactly what we see. So if you go with an STM tip on top of one of these atoms, and we see them switching, you can see here histograms. And for the STM specialists, 50 picometers apparent height difference is a huge amount. So spin up and spin down here have distinguished themselves by 50 picometers apparent height difference, or if you want to look into the tunnel current, spin up and spin down state have a difference in tunnel current of a factor of 5 or even more than 5. So that's a huge amount. It's a huge tunnel magnetic resistance. So we know now for dysprosium on graphene, these are systems that have a strong polarization in the outer shells. So you can ask yourself whether it's a good idea to describe a system that has a strong polarization in the valence shells by simply a quantum number, which is Jz, or projection of J along the out-of-plane direction, but considering only the 4f electrons. So that's what everyone does in molecular magnets, for example. They look into this J that comes from the 4f electrons. And we have basically a model which is a little bit more sophisticated. So the good quantum number in our point of view is something which combines this moment that comes from the 4f shells with the moment that comes from the outer shells. Now, if you come up with such an idea, you have to know how strong are they coupled, because it's inside the atom, basically, they have some coupling. and this coupling seems to be relatively strong. We measured this coupling, so if you look into this diagram here, you have 4F filling of the dysprosium states, and you have the spin of the external shells pointing up or pointing down. We measured actually how much they couple. So you can do this with transitions that are intraatomic exchange excitations. So in principle, we have here the ground state where the valence moment is parallel to the 4F moment. And then as soon as we reach this energy here, we excite the system into the opposite state. So we can measure by the energies here, the excitation threshold energies for the different systems. So if you look into the energies, for example, for dysprosium, the system that we are discussing now, it's 100 millieV. So this is a huge energy compared to all the energies that are that we discussed. So in principle, one can safely assume that the real system should be described by a magnetic moment, which is composed of the J that comes from the 4F electrons plus this polarization of the external shells. And we have some evidence for this. I just show you the two models. So one model is the one that everyone applies so far. You just look into J, and you have the ground state, which is ±7 for the system dysprosium on graphene. And now if you go to ±6, I told you that the states that can talk to each other have the same color. So ±6 can be divided by the 6-fold symmetry of the adsorption side of graphene. So as soon as you reach this energy, you cross over and you can tunnel through this barrier. So if this model would be a good description, then we would need to inject electrons that have 5.5 millieV, for example. Then you reach this state and you can cross over, or you heat your system and there should be some energy in an Arrhenius plot that corresponds to this excitation energy here. Now, if we come up with our model, which takes into account the 5D and the 6s electrons and their polarization, it looks completely different. So in principle, we have to look into the total angular momentum, which is having this spin momentum included. And then your ground state is ±8, so that's quite different to have ±7 or ±8. And it can go to ±9 because the spin adds. So the system has ±9. ±9 is coupled by the 6-fold symmetry of the crystal field. So as soon as it is here, it can tunnel through the barrier. Or you have ±6 in total, and then you can also cross over. So we have investigated with just looking at the switching rate as a function of temperature, whether one model or the other applies. Remember, if we have the first model that everyone uses, there's only one energy barrier. So the first model would give us in the Arrhenius presentation basically just a single slope. And the reality is more complicated. So in reality, you have here these two different slopes, which looks like a slightly bent curve that we measure as a function of temperature. So the switching rate as a function of temperature cannot be described by a single slope. And this means that this model that we are proposing is the right one to consider these systems. Okay, so now let's go to the next one. This one doesn't work anymore. Sorry for this. Okay, so the next slide, in the next slide, I wanted to show you something that you might have already thought about. So I was telling you that holmium has a ground state of ±8 because we were looking for a system that have a very high total angular momentum. And if you look onto the left-hand side, that's the level scheme that we really establish with STM spin excitations and with X-ray magnetic circular dichroism. And you see the ground state is ±8. And then you go to these excited states. The anisotropy energy is 180 millieV roughly. And from the different excitation energies here, you can measure also the level schemes, basically the energies where the different magnetization levels are. But I was telling you that one has to look into the difference between these two different states, and this difference is 16. And now you have to divide this by the crystal field symmetry, and the crystal field symmetry is 4. So everyone who tells you that holmium is a stable magnet is normally either not measuring correctly or there's something more to the system. Because by definition, a ground state of ±8 cannot be stable in a fourfold crystal field. So in principle, if you go to zero magnetic field, these two cannot be seen as two different states. They are basically in the middle here, and the total magnetic moment is zero. So you have a superposition state of spin up and spin down. Now, how can we explain that this holmium is nevertheless a stable state? So you can either say you just need a magnetic field to make it stable, or something else happens. And there are two ways to explain it. One is that you take into account the polarization of the external shells again, and they couple strongly to this total angular momentum. And this means that the ground state is not ±8, the ground state is ±8.2 or 8.1 or something. And a good quantum number is not the J that comes from the 4F electrons only, but the total angular momentum composed of the two different levels, two different shells, external shells and internal shells. So the first proposition why holmium should be as stable as we observe it has to do with the external shells. Second proposition is that the nuclear spins play a role. Holmium has a nuclear spin of 7.5. And here you have the Jz, which is the projection of the total angular momentum of the electron spin. And then you have the nuclear spin quantum numbers here. And you can see that you have different energies for these different levels. And the energies, that's well known, it's roughly in the range of 3.4, 3.7 microelectron volts, this interaction between the electron spin and the nuclear spin, hyperfine interaction. So if you come up with these interactions, you have some crossings that are real and some crossings that are avoided level crossings. For example, if you look into this state that is shown here, you have here, if there were no interaction at all with the nuclear spins, you would have a avoided level crossing. And since there is interaction with the nuclear spins, you have a real level crossing. And for these points that are shown here, you have avoided level crossings. And this means that you have a superposition state here of the two different states. And by sweeping your field across these superposition states, you can intentionally switch your system. And depending on the sweeping frequency, it will switch more often or less often. So in principle, there are two things that are possible origins of the stability of holmium, which is one of our most stable single atom magnets. And I think we need further experiments to pin this down really, what is the origin of the stability, either nuclear spin or the polarization of the external shells. Okay, so let me finish by a few slides about some future perspectives. So we are far away from being able to have really single atom qubits in a sense. At least we cannot make single atom qubits that are outperforming other qubit systems so far. And one motivation why we should try, nevertheless, very hard to do this is that there are some single atom qubits that work with spin that are already existing. And they have coherence times that are pretty large. And this can motivate studies of single atoms also at surfaces. And these single atoms are, again, rare earth atoms. And I just show you three examples. One example is where they measure the coherence time of the electron spins of one certain isotope of erbium atoms. And these erbium atoms are dissolved as single impurities in such a crystal. And if you measure at magnetic fields at below 0.3 Tesla and at temperatures below 1 Kelvin, they get coherence times which are in the range of 100 microseconds. This is for the electron spin. Now, if we go to the nuclear spin, which is more protected, there are times that are even much more higher that have been observed in these systems. For example, erbium, a certain isotope here in this substrate, they can measure 1 second roughly. And there's a special measurement here that has reported coherence times of 6 hours. So there we are really in a regime where you could do quantum coherent operations on such a system for many, many minutes. And you can basically use them as a qubit. And these are systems that are already used because they are working by optical readout in principle and in a frequency regime which is used for telecommunication. So it's something that is employed as a quantum repeater in a sense. So you can imagine to make a World Wide Web that does work with quantum mechanics, where you send superposition states around. And these are systems that can be used as a repeater for these systems. We have actually some results where we looked with XMCD in a collaboration with Fabio and also with Andreas into some of the promising systems. So the conditions that you need to fulfill to have a single atom qubit are very different from having a single atom magnet. In order to have a single atom qubit, you need to have a superposition state between two states, and you need to have a ground state that can have this superposition state in principle. So it's a little bit the other way around what you're looking for. We're looking for a system that has a long T2, and we're looking for systems that have this inverted parabola in a way. So these are two systems, erbium and thulium, sitting both on MgO surfaces, and the ground state is ±1/2. And the first excited state is actually quite far away for this system here. The first excited state is 60 millieV away. So it's a ground state doublet that is very well protected. So in principle, it's something which is really promising. Okay, let me just close my talk by pointing out my collaborators, Stefano Rosboni, Maria Pivetta, François Patet, and Dante and Alberto, who have contributed to the work being in my lab. And then there are some collaborators who contributed being formerly having been in my lab and being at different places now. And you can see that there are one collaborator who joined here the operation of Andreas Heinrich 6 years ago, Fabio. And then Stefano, this is for the work that we are doing with these rare earth potential single atom qubits. And then Fabian has created his own group in Zurich. Christian has created his own group at the PSI and is also attached to the EPFL. And Jan is a scientist at the Paul Scherrer Institute in Willigen. And let me just tell you also that we are not only living in such a nice area, so we are doing work where we try to explore what I showed at the very last part of my talk, and we have two postdoc openings in my group. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Harald, for the amazing presentation and then for putting all this nice work and the amazing journey in one story. So also on my side, I must say I'm very honored to be part of this journey and to continue to collaborate with Harald with many projects here in QNS. So I think now it's time for questions from the audience and from the people on Zoom. So maybe let's give priority first to our student, maybe. That's QNS habit. We have a volunteer.
Hello. So for this project on graphene atom, it forms particular patterns. So I was wondering if nearby atom can affect the switching rate of the dispersion atom.
Okay, that's okay. So in this image that I showed, they are sitting 2.5 nanometers away from each other, and they don't interact at all. And why can I be so sure about it? So we have made some measurements of samples where we put down the dysprosium atoms at temperatures where they cannot diffuse at all and where they don't form the superlattice. So in that case, some dysprosium atoms are sitting very close, much closer than what we have here. And then some sit far apart, but you have some areas where they sit very close and they still have the same magnetization curves. So in principle, if you look into the ensemble magnetization curves, the ones that I showed you with these steps, they don't change. So these are curves that we can record on a sample where we deposit the atoms at very low temperatures where they cannot diffuse at all, and at samples where they form this nice superlattice. So this means they don't have to be 2.5 nanometers apart. They can be very close even. So we have calculated that, for example, holmium needs an external field of 8 Tesla and it doesn't switch. So you would have to apply even bigger fields. So you have to be pretty close between two atoms to have a stray field of one atom that has 8 Tesla that acts on the neighboring atom. So I think at some point there might be some interactions that start to come into play, which are not only from the stray field, but also real Heisenberg exchange interactions, and then it will be different. But according to our experience, you can put them like a nanometer is no problem. You can put them at a nanometer distance, nanometer is no problem. But of course, if you put them too close, they would interact, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah, Massim, you want to ask a question?
Thank you for your nice talk. I just have one question. In the part of dysprosium on graphene, on this part, the role of valence of photoelectrons, you said that with like the counts as apparent height, as a function of apparent height, you show two populations. And then you said that it comes from the 5d6s electrons. It's not completely straightforward to make this conclusion, right? Just with STM.
So in principle,
this one.
The STM is having a hard time to see the F electrons. The F electrons are strongly localized, and so far there was not a single observation where you could really see spin contrast in the F electrons directly. The systems where spin contrast has been observed for F systems are all systems where you have some polarization in the external shells. For example, if you look into a magnetic molecule that has a rare earth atom, also there are some delocalized states that are spin polarized that you can read out, but it's very hard to read out the localized for F electrons. That's why I'm saying this.
Okay.
So for me, it's basically such that if you have a contrast of 5 picometers or 2 picometers, the spin polarization must be such and such in the external shells. And if you have this contrast of 50 picometers, the spin polarization must be pretty high. So according to this, it would be like holmium, dysprosium should have a very small spin polarization, only 10%, 20% or so of electron transfer. And this one is an extreme example where almost a full electron is transferred.
Another question? Well, I see there is a question from the audience on Zoom. So are there any ideas to increase stability of single atom magnets for higher temperature or non-vacuum conditions?
Okay, that's a very good point. So if we claim that we can store information in the moment, we can do this only in ultra high vacuum. So we are working in the moment to transfer graphene, for example, in ultra high vacuum in order to cap these systems with a graphene layer. So I can imagine that having a 6-fold symmetry of the dysprosium atoms below and above will give rise to very interesting properties. So it can be that we can conserve these systems and also increase their magnetic properties by capping them with graphene. So this is one answering maybe one question. And the other point is if you want to make them more stable, one has to look for systems that don't start to diffuse. So these are atoms that have a magnetic stability up to 30 and something Kelvin, maybe 35, 40 Kelvin roughly. Even this dysprosium can potentially be stable up to 30 Kelvin, I can imagine. But at 50 or 60 Kelvin or so, they will start to diffuse. So if they are sitting on a surface, they will start to diffuse at some point. If you want to go to higher temperatures, one has to embed them into surfaces, but then they lose their interesting properties in many cases, because then they would form bonds to the neighbors in the surface where they are embedded. And in many cases, this simply kills everything that you are looking for. But there might be some cases where maybe Fabio will find systems where these embedded atoms are stable magnets, but it's really a challenge. So the other way is to go with the chemical approach. So in principle, the chemical systems are known to be inert. There are some systems, for example, terbium double decker is inert. You can expose it to air. We have done this and look at the magnetic properties before doing this and after, and they are the same. They are also very stable magnets. So there you are already one step further if you want. But on the other hand, it's difficult with STM to read these systems out. So it's very challenging to read these systems out, double deckers at least.
I see we have a question probably with the from Shinje from the audience. Maybe she wants to ask the question live. Hi, Shinje.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I missed something or I misunderstood something, but I feel a little hard to understand the using superposition of the rare earth atoms, because for example, using the iron and chromium atom on MgO, you can change the chromium state using the iron atom maybe, but in the rare earth atom, I guess you are changing the you are changing the state by changing the 4f electron at the outer shell. Did I understand that? Or?
So in principle, the magnetic stability comes from the 4f electrons, not from the outer electrons. And the 4f has this high magnetocrystalline anisotropy, and the outer electrons are just coupled by 100 millieV or so to the 4f electrons, so the outer ones follow. Does this reply to your question?
Yes, maybe. Thank you. I mean, yeah, my question was if the 4f, the good thing to use a rare earth atom is the 4f atom is strongly coupled with the neutron atom, nuclear atom. Sorry.
So in principle, the coupling between the electronic spins and the nuclear spins is very weak. But and you can also think in first approximation. In first approximation, you could say that I don't know why this doesn't work anymore, but you could say that the coupling is so weak that it doesn't play a role actually. So in principle, it's very tempting to say that these nuclear spins are having only a few microelectron volts coupling. So why should I care about them? But what happens really is that's the fascinating thing with quantum mechanics. You can have states which are these avoided level crossings, which come from the nuclear spins. They don't come from the electron spins. So even if there is a very small coupling strength, which is the one that I mentioned here, it's only 3 microelectron volts. It is sufficient to make of a real level crossing an avoided level crossing. And then the switching rate is dramatically different. So the nuclear spins play a role. I'm firmly convinced. I'm not sure whether it's the reason for the stability of holmium. So there are these two options that I put on the table, and we will see in a few months or years maybe which one is the right one.
Okay, thank you. And can you independently change the I mean, the electron is really close to your nuclear spin. So I am wondering whether you can independently change the, not independently, but if the electron.
So in principle,
so maybe I will think about it more.
No, the electron spin, so the electron spin is far away from the nuclear spin. The nuclear spin is really concentrated on the nucleus. And then you have for a long distance, really vacuum. And then there are these electron wave functions that have a certain probability of residence, and they have their maximum at a distance of, let's say, 1 angstrom or so for the 4f. And then further out, you have the external shells for the rare earth. And these are the ones that we can address with STM. But the coupling strength is pretty small.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the questions. We have another written question on the chat, which is when the atoms switch the magnetization, they also mechanically rotate based on the Einstein-Diaz effect.
No, so they stay where they are and they don't need to rotate. So in principle, it's really a degree of freedom that the atoms can use. For example, if they are bound in an organic molecule, the only thing that rotates is the magnetic moment. So it's a quantum mechanical system where you have 1 degree of freedom, which is the projection of the states onto a certain axis in space, and you have expectation values for these projections, and it's not necessary that the atom rotates.
I think this is a very much open question, and because the angular momentum should be taken over by some other quasi-particle, probably maybe phonons or vibration. But I think
in principle you have the whole crystal below that can take the angular momentum in order to conserve it.
Yeah. So are there other questions from our audience here in QNS? Yes, Stefano.
So I was wondering if you should see the effect of this nuclear relaxation event when you sweep the field in the XMCD experiment, for example, because in the loop you measure, it seems pretty open, and we don't see these steps typical of relaxation.
Yeah, that's also a good point. So in principle, this brings me back to these loops. So the loop that we measure with XMCD is not necessarily the magnetization loop of the unperturbed system, and not necessarily the one that you expect for only one species. So if you had only oxygen sites and you would not perturb the system, then Fabio would never have been able to measure this curve, because even at 8 Tesla, they don't switch. So in principle, this curve is a result of interacting strongly with the system by the photons that produce secondary electrons that allow switching. So the holmium itself would not switch, even at 8 Tesla. But then, of course, you can ask the question, so what happens here at around 0 Tesla? Is not the intrinsic system switching at 0 Tesla? And this depends on the nuclear spin. This really is something that depends strongly on the nuclear spin or on the polarization of the external shell. So as I said, that's an open question in the moment in my point of view. But here the problem is that we have two different species, and with STM we can only characterize the samples that are never used in XMCD, because in STM we can go up to 1, 2 monolayers or maybe 3 monolayers of MgO, and in XMCD we need to put down like 5 monolayers or so to have a full coverage of MgO. So it's 2 different systems that we are looking at, and you can even have the malchance that the filling of the 4F levels is also changing with the height of the MgO. So it can be that we are looking here in reality not only at 2 different species like oxygen sites and bridge sites, but it can be that we are looking at 4F10 and 4F11, for example. And this is something that is now clear in our mind. So when we look at these data, we take into account sometimes 3 species that are contributing, or even more.
I see another question from the chat. So when spin polarized STM was applied to image the magnetization of single atoms, should one has to use a small voltage to avoid exciting coupling to the external shell? Yes, so that's definitely the case. I was showing examples where we put in on purpose a certain voltage to switch them. And this was 140 millivolt. So each time you see the spikes here, we have put in 140 millivolt to switch it on purpose. And then we read out the system at which state it is. And when the state is the one we like, then we remove the voltage and we go to only 50 millieV. And if you look into these level diagrams that I showed you, the level diagram has these first excited states at 70 millieV.
for holmium. So in principle, at 70 millieV roughly, you should go to this first excited state, and then there can be some switching happening. So if you stay below 70 millieV, you should not switch it with the tunnel electrons.
Right. I think it was great to have so many questions from the audience and then from the people on Zoom. I think probably it's time to wrap up. And thanks again, Harald, for the talk, and everybody for attending. So the next one leaves. So the next colloquium was scheduled to be held by Philip Kim, but he couldn't make it for January. So we have a vacancy at the moment. So if anyone wants to suggest a speaker for the next colloquium, we are welcome to accept suggestion. Otherwise, Philip Kim will probably give a colloquium later on, probably in June next year. Okay, so with this, I want to close the talk. Thanks again, and see you at the next colloquium.